Hi everyone, welcome back. So on this channel I look at classics, fantasy and Gothic literature. Recently I made a video on Gothic literature and why I think it's a good genre to read, and today I want to do a similar video but for classics. But instead of looking at why you should read classic literature, which is something I might do in the future, today I wanted to talk about how to get into classic literature if you've not read any before, or if you have read a bit but you want to get more into it. With everyone pretty much stuck inside, I think this is a really good time to dig into something new, so if you have been thinking that you want to get into classic literature, then hopefully you'll find some useful advice in this video. So without further ado, here are 5 tips that I have for getting into classic literature. The first tip that I have is forget what you learned about classics in school. This might not apply to everyone, it probably depends what kind of school you went to, but I remember when I was in school and we did English literature, I really didn't care very much for classics. Partly because it was being forced on us to read these books, partly because I was younger so I didn't really understand a lot of the stuff that was going on in these texts, and partly because it was just boring and the teaching was kind of crap, so it just didn't interest me. Now I think there are a lot of people, and I include myself in this, who have, because of that bad experience in school, then just don't really want to get into classic literature later on in life, but I think that's a mistake. And the first thing that I would recommend you do is forget those bad experiences if you had them, and try and look at classics with a fresh eye, because you might find that even things you read in school that you hated then, you like now. As an example from my own life, I read Angela Carter's Bloody Chamber in school, didn't really like it that much, didn't really get it, and now Angela Carter is one of my favourite authors, and The Bloody Chamber is one of my favourite books. So you can definitely see how just maturing, getting away from school, and growing up a bit can make you appreciate something that you hated when you were younger. Also, don't forget, classic literature is huge. It covers all genres of fiction. It's basically just old, famous texts. So there's so much there. So don't judge the whole set of classic literature or the whole canon of classic literature based on a few bad experiences or a few dud novels that you might have read when you were younger. Okay, so my second piece of advice is don't let anyone choose what you should read. A common strategy I think for people when they're getting into a new genre, especially something like classics, might be to look at a list of like the most influential novels of all time or the best novels of all time. Now this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be helpful as a research project to kind of get a sense of for what books are out there, but I don't think it's necessarily a good way to get into classic literature if you've not read it before. Just because some book is touted as the best book of all time, it does not mean you will like that book very much. Even if you can appreciate its significance, you might just not like the story, you might not like the characters, the plot, its themes, anything like that. So I wouldn't recommend getting one of these lists and working through them if you're just getting into classics. Instead, what I'd recommend is trying to choose for yourself what you would like to read. So what I would recommend doing is thinking about the kind of books that you like now, and then finding books that are in a similar sort of style or genre or have similar themes in the classic canon, and that's where you would begin your journey into classics. The reason why I recommend this is because if you like those kinds of books already, even if they're obviously newer ones, you might find that the older ones, because they have a similar connection, you might enjoy them more than if you just read something on a list that isn't really your thing. For myself, because I really like dark Gothic fiction, my way into classics was through Gothic literature, and through there I kind of expand, and now I like much more diverse much more diverse genres in the classic canon. So that's what I'd recommend. Use best of lists to research and to get a sense of what's out there. When it comes to choosing what to read something that you think you'll enjoy, and because it's either something that's similar to a genre that you like, or you know a bit about the plot and it seems interesting to you. You'll find that if you do this, you'll be much more likely to enjoy the books that you're reading, and the only way to get into anything is to enjoy it, so you want to up your chances in terms of enjoyment straight away from the beginning. The next piece of advice that I would give is to do a bit of research on the author and also the plot of the book that you're thinking about reading. So I also made a video in the past about spoilers and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to have a story spoiled for you. And one of the points that I made in that video was that it can be good to actually have a book spoiled for you. Because if you know what the story's about, then when you read it for the first time, you don't have to pay attention to the plot as much. You can focus more on the characters, on the themes, on the broader aspects of the novel and the craft, rather than just trying to understand, what the hell's going on. This is really good for classics because, especially old classics, like, if you're going medieval or older, the language is going to be difficult, challenging, and it can be really hard to understand what's going on. So a good thing to do can actually be to know what the plot is going in. This might seem weird, you might think then what's the point reading it, But you'll find that actually if you know what's going on when you get into the book, you'll be less likely to lose focus, get disinterested because you have no idea what's going on, and you'll probably be able to appreciate the novel for the broader themes and ideas, which by and large are the reasons why these books have stood the test of time. It's because of their enduring qualities, like, you know, a plot that's universal or an amazing character or something like that. So I really would recommend doing a bit of research into the book. Also do some research into the author as well. Oftentimes I find that if I do a lot of research into an author and their life, then when I read their books, I can get a much bigger appreciation for what's going on. As an example here, I'd say Virginia Woolf is a great example for me. So I read To the Lighthouse last year, I think now, and I did some research into Virginia Woolf's life and her relationship with her mother and father and how that ties into that book, and it just made me appreciate the book way more than I would have done if I didn't know that information, because you can relate to the author and their work in a deeper way if you know things about their lives, about the context in which the book was written, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, definitely do some research when you're getting into classics, because it helps a lot in appreciating the books overall. The next suggestion that I have is to try and read some literary criticism. Now, when I say literary criticism, I don't necessarily mean academic journal articles or, you know, stuff that universities put out, because that can be as incomprehensible as the books, you know, really old books themselves, so it's probably not going to help you get into or understand or appreciate the books that you're going to read. But there are some books of literary criticism that I think are really accessible and engaging for someone who doesn't have a degree, and I think they're really worth checking out. Again, the reason for this is that you're reading something by someone who knows these texts really well, who has interesting things to say about them, and again, that can really encourage you to not only read and pick certain books, but understand and appreciate where these books are coming from. I read a great book by Camille Paglia called Sexual Personae, which was published in the 90s, and it's this huge book where she goes from ancient Egypt all the way to Emily Dickinson, so it's a big stretch of time, and she looks at various artists and writers throughout that time period. And some of the books in that I'd already read before, but after reading this book, I could see those books in a whole new light, so that when I went back and read them again, I enjoyed them even more. A good example of this is her chapter on Emily Bronte, and Wuthering Heights in particular. Wuthering Heights was a book that I found quite challenging and didn't really get the first time I read it, but after reading Paglia's discussion of that book, where she talks about it being a battle between forces of nature and all these kinds of things, it really opened up my eyes to that book, and when I read it again, it just blew my mind. It was way more interesting because I'd done that bit of research. So yeah, I'd recommend doing a bit of research into literary criticism, probably more from the public intellectual side of things rather than hardcore academia, because, as I said, it can be very hard to understand what's going on in academia and literature. And I speak from experience of reading that stuff and not really finding it all that engaging. And with lockdown going on, it could be another hobby to get into literary criticism as a genre of fiction that's not only interesting in its own right, but can also help you appreciate classics. And even with fiction that's going on now, it can really help you appreciate new and old things in new and interesting ways. Okay, so say you've done all your research, you've looked at some literary criticism maybe, you've done some research, you've picked books that you think you'll like based on the books or the genres that you already know that you like. How then to actually decide which of your selection of books that you picked, which one to begin with? And again, I'm going to use my own experience of getting into Gothic literature as an example here. So, the only Gothic novel that I'd read before I started really getting into the genre was Dracula, which I read in school, and again, read it in school, so I didn't really appreciate it all that much. Then coming back to the genre and wanting to get into it, I picked shorter novels first. One of the first Gothic novels that I read was Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. This is a tiny book. I think might not even be 100 pages, or it's just over 100 pages. It's really short, it's really simple, and that was a nice gateway to getting into then bigger novels. Then I reread Dracula because I'd already read it before, so I was somewhat familiar with the language and the style, and again, having reread it, I actually really enjoyed it. And then from there I went to something a bit more ambitious. I tried reading The Monk, so again, it's a very similar style of prose, kind of dense, theatrical, Gothic stuff. And then from there I decided to take a step up, and I went with The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe, which is about 500 or 600 pages, so much bigger in scope, much longer, much more of a challenging read overall. And that for me worked really well, and I think it's a good piece of advice. If I'd have started by reading Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho, I might not have actually enjoyed it it might have just been too much, eyes bigger than your belly type thing. So I'd have put it down, and I'd have just kind of, don't want to try that ever again. But by getting familiar with shorter texts, more accessible text first, and then also completing them text, which is always nice, because if you complete a book, you feel good about it, whereas if you give a book up, you don't. That helped me then take on bigger, more ambitious novels. So I'd recommend that to you as well. When you're starting, pick shorter books first. Even if there is something that's big that you're really interested in reading, it might be good to hold that off, start with something shorter, and then work your way up to the more ambitious, complex novels. Generally, I think that's a good strategy with any task that you really want to do. If you start small and achieve things at the small level, you're going to feel better about it, you're going to get more used to the dialogue in terms of writing or the prose style, and all those kinds of things. And then you can progress to more complex things, and you'll find that you're able to appreciate them a lot more than if you begin with a huge thing and it's just too much and you give up. Okay, so those are my 5 pieces of advice for how to get into classics. I might follow this up in a week or two with a why you should read classics, similar to the video that I did on Gothic literature earlier, because I do think I have a lot to say about that. Reading a lot of stuff about classics recently has really kind of fired up my appreciation for them, and I'd really like to share that fire and that appreciation with you guys. So be on the lookout for that video coming soon. As for this video though, that's all I have to say. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you want to see more, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also let me know in the comments, what are your strategies for tackling classics? What are your thoughts on classics as a genre? I'm always interested to hear how different people's experiences of the genre. How was it for you in school? Did you hate it as much as I did? Or was your school really good at and engaging with teaching classics? I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say in the comments, and I also look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care, everyone.